So here we're going to discuss Citrix XenServer and its implementation of virtualization. But before we can begin, we really have to discuss a little bit of an intro, if you will, as to what virtualization is, what hypervisor is, specific features of XenServer, the different types of virtualization, and the architectural components that make up XenServer. First of all, let me tell you about legacy data centers and really a little bit more about what data centers are and what they were. Data centers in the past and not too distant past were filled with machines that, they were very crowded, took up a lot of power, took up a whole lot of space. Well, data centers still take up a lot of space. The only issue is back then, I don't really want to refer to back then as it was too long ago, but probably within the last decade or less, data centers were filled with servers that were eating up a lot of power, and they were basically dead weight. And what I mean by dead weight is they were severely underutilized. Many times, there was a one-to-one relationship between the server and the application. There was one server that was dedicated to database services, let's say. One that was involved with domain controller and Windows Active Directory. Another one that was serving up IIS, and another one that was serving up file services. Another one that was serving up print server, and so on, and the list went on and on. There was only one problem with that. By having one physical box to serve a domain controller or a database server, really what happened is that too many resources in terms of RAM, processor, network, disk were wasted. The server, for example, may have had a 4 or 8 gigs of RAM, and it may have had hundreds of gigs of disk space, and it may have had multi-processors. Most of it was wasted. The server was utilized about 10 to 15% of the time. This was all over every data center in the entire nation, perhaps the entire world. And the problem with that is organizations invest, financial resources, and they invest technical resources to allocate and maintain that server. If an organization had 10 or 12 database servers, let's say, many organizations had a lot more than that, but if an organization had 10 or 12 database servers, they had to maintain 10 or 12 physical servers. And maintaining 10 or 12 physical servers, that's not really a big problem, except you have to take care of everything that goes wrong with physical hardware in terms of fan and power supply and hard disks and everything else that's a moving part. On top of the whole thing, it was very, very likely that that database server or that physical piece of hardware was only being utilized, 10, 15% of the time. The resources that were needed were not that great. So, applications and services that were configured on that particular box were really meant for that hardware. A vendor would simply say that, hey, I want to have my database server on its own piece of hardware. And every vendor would say that. You could not mix and match multiple database servers with multiple vendors and multiple applications. Everything had its own entity. And this is really where virtualization shined and where its need became very apparent. I'll tell you from my perspective, I would have never thought of this. I would have never thought it was possible. Little did I know, right? Well, virtualization is really the process of separating the physical components of a computing infrastructure from the logical processes that demand the resources. In short, virtualization makes it possible for you to have multiple virtual machines inside of one physical hardware. So virtualization technologies provide significant benefits to the consumers and to the businesses. They allow components to save very valuable resources, and they offer several hidden cost savings. I can actually take multiple database servers, let's say, and put them on one physical box. I can have multiple web servers, put them on one physical box. There is a technology, virtualization, in this case, Citrix XenServer, that makes it possible for me to place multiple operating systems on one physical box. Well, here's the thing. You may think to yourself, if you've been around for a little while, well, we were able to do that utilizing dual boot and multi-boot scenarios in the past. Maybe you remember that, where you installed Windows and you installed Linux systems or perhaps multiple versions of Windows on the same exact system on multiple partitions. There was only one problem with that. And that problem was you had to exit out of the current operating system to get into the other operating system. If you wanted to switch between Windows and Linux, you had to do that by shutting down Windows and then starting Linux on a different partition. You can't run multiple things that way. You can't run something on Linux and run something on Windows at the same exact time on the same exact machine if you had to turn one machine off and then turn the other machine on. There are a whole host of other problems with that as well that I won't get into at the moment. But with virtualization, it's possible to have both operating systems running in parallel, if you will, on different virtual machines using their own set of resources, their own processor, their own RAM, their own disk, their own networking resources and such, and running applications and services as they would if they were physical machines. And this is possible by something called a hypervisor.